Yeah.
Okay, that's good. All right. There we go. Alrighty. There we go. Okay, the lights are always this balance between dim enough so you can see the screen well, but not so dark that you all fall asleep. So, especially because this room tends to get nice and warm. Okay, so today we're going to start on a new topic, right? So we've kind of, in a sense, put aside our history of youth and childhood, at least the one that kind of goes back really far to like the Middle Ages. And we're going to step forward in time a little bit with a slightly different focus, right? So we're going to start talking about some generational cohorts, right? Starting with the silent generation, then moving our way up to Gen Z and maybe Gen Alpha. If I have time to add a few slides here, based on some preliminary data, we will 100% do that. Okay, so let me jump one slide forward. Same Slido code as we had before, and all of that fun stuff. So if you have questions, you can continue to put them in there. Okay, these are mostly questions from last time. The stream for today is nor showing up. Should be. I just started it. I was a little late starting it, so it should be there now. Yeah, I was a little bit late because it was 20 minutes to 2. I hadn't had lunch yet, and I was starting to feel a little dizzy. So I jammed down some lunch on my way, so I was a little bit late getting here. Okay, this I answered last time. I actually opened up 10 more seats for SOC of Religion, and they filled up in like 7 minutes. It was crazy. I could open more, but the marking is going to get to me. Okay, I think I answered this last time and this last time as well. All right, so I'm going to start talking about our different generational cohorts. So we're taking a bit of a jump, right? So we kind of ended talking, somewhere in the early 20th century, right? The 1910s, a little bit in the 1920s. Now there's a little bit of a gap, right? We're going to leave out one really important, or maybe a couple of important generational cohorts that we're not going to talk about, specifically what's sometimes called the lost generation, the generation that kind of fights in the First World War, and then the greatest generation, right? The generation that fights in the Second World War. The reason we're going to leave them off is because they're no longer alive, right? There's certainly no lost generation people left, because they'd be like in their 130s at this point, and nobody lives that long, at least not yet. The greatest generation, there's maybe a few of them kicking around, but their cultural impact is pretty muted at this point. So we're going to jump right forward into talking about the silent generation, Now, the silence, there's not that many of them left either, but their cultural impact is such I think we do need to talk about them. Okay, so we're going to take a lot of what we're saying here from a couple of sources. Let me talk slower. A couple of sources. Most prominently, though, we're going to look at this book, which is a book called Generations by San Diego State University psychologist Jean Twenge. You're going to hear that name a lot throughout the course. Jean has become sort of a staple in discussions about youth because she has been studying different generational cohorts since she was doing her PhD studies. She started looking at Gen X, moved on to millennials, rather rudely, I might add. Her book on, she has two books on millennials. One's called Generation Me, and the other one was called The Narcissism Epidemic. So, okay, Jean, tell us how you really feel. And then she's written on Gen Z as well in a book called iGen, talking about the impact of smartphones. So we're gonna meet her. We're gonna talk about her here and there throughout the course, and she comes back at the end for sure because she and Jonathan Haidt have been doing a lot of work on youth psychology and especially the impact of smartphones and social media and the kind of mix of the two of them and what that's done specifically to Gen Z's mental health, right? Now, she wrote this book a couple of years ago, and she gives, I think, a really, really interesting kind of look at generations and what's shaped kind of our living generations in a way that I think will tell us a lot about who they are, what their priorities are, what has shaped them, and will give us, I think, a sense of what's going to come next for younger generations like Gen Alpha and, I don't know, Gen Beta. Who wants to be in Gen Beta? That would just be the worst, right? We need better names. I'm on board for this. Okay, so in the book, she argues for what she calls the technology model of generations. Now, I feel like this has a nice little continuity with what we just did talking about Postman, right? Because Postman talks about that 500-year-long sort of effect of the introduction of the printing press. Now, one of the things that's definitely true of the generations who lived through the 20th century and from the middle of the 20th century to the kind of, I guess, quarter mark of the 21st century is that they too are shaped by technologies, right? And their experience of the world are deeply shaped by technologies, but the pace of technological change has accelerated considerably, right? And if you think about it this way, and you know, if we talk about some of the struggles that, say, millennials and Gen Z are having, and Gen Alpha as well, think about it this way. We just talked about that 500-year process of what it took for culture to kind of catch up to the invention of the printing press and all of its social effects, right? But that was, you know, a culture or a set of cultures that had 5 centuries to sort of figure that out. The 20th century was marked by the introduction of a lot of new technologies, but not a lot of time for, you know, us to adapt culturally to what those technologies actually mean, right? And we've gone from, you know, radio, television, films, not in that order, the computers, the internet, video games, smartphones, and now I guess AI, right? In a really rapid succession where culture is having a little bit of trouble catching up. So we're going to kind of look at that as we go through. Okay, so in her cultural model of generations, right, what she suggests, I mentioned this last time, is that each generation that we're going to talk about is ultimately defined by the technological conditions that it experienced in its formative years, right? So teens and early 20s. That's the kind of time where a lot of your sense of culture is being set, meaning it's way too late for me. So we're going to get a sense of what the technologies were and how they affected people's kind of relationship to the world. And these technologies, right, affect various aspects of life, including family, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, and mental health. Now, we're gonna talk about technologies in some cases in a pretty broad way. Sometimes we're going to mean media, and media definitely plays a huge role, but especially when we talk about, say, the silence and the boomers, there's a bunch of other technologies that we would probably treat today as quite mundane that I think play a big effect. But I don't want to spoil it, so I'm going to save that for when we get to them. Okay, the other thing, new technologies can sometimes create generation gaps, right? And this is something people started talking about, with the gap between the boomers and Gen X, that there seemed to be like a cultural disconnect between these generations that was hard to kind of patch together. What essentially happens is the cultural and technological context of one generation ends up being so different from another that basically they're out of sync with each other and they have a hard time understanding the world the other one lives in. Okay, and yeah, one thing that we'll note, and as you see the kind of dates as we lay them out, because the pace of technological change is accelerating, basically the length of our generational cohorts will get shorter as we move towards the present, right? So the silence is relatively long, as is the boomers, but with each of like Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, that kind of time period gets a little bit shorter. Okay, so one of the kind of distinctions or concepts that Twenge brings to bear on how generations sort of exist and how they relate to the world is by using what she calls what is called, she didn't make it up, life history theory, and differentiating between essentially two types of life plans that people can have, right? Or life strategies. And basically, historically, there are two life strategies that you can adopt, right? So parents essentially have a choice. But in a sense, it's not really a choice, right? This choice is largely dictated by culture. And social forces. I mean, in theory, you could make another choice, but most people don't even see it as a choice. And we'll talk about that as we go forward as well. Okay, so the two choices are you can have many children and expect them to grow up relatively quickly, which we will call, or she calls, the fast life strategy. Or you can have fewer children and expect them to grow up more slowly. Now, there are conditions that tend to lead to one or the other, right? You are going to tend to see a fast life strategy when there's a higher risk of death. Oops, that's a pen, not what I wanted. I got so focused on picking a color, I forgot to switch to the highlighter. There we go. More common when there's the risk of death is higher for adults and babies, right? So in periods of higher mortality, right, the kind of cultural strategy, if you want to have children and children who make it, you have more of them and you expect them to become independent more quickly, right? So having more of them and earlier in life, right, more towards your teens and early 20s, means they're more likely to be self-sufficient before one or both parents die, right? So, have them early, the older you get, the higher your chances of death, all of these kinds of things. And this has been the historical norm for human beings, right? And even in other parts of the world, right, that aren't as technologically advanced as the kind of the West or really advanced parts of Asia, this is still the norm, right? Where basically you have a lot of kids, you have them relatively early, but you have an expectation of high infant and parental mortality. And just to illustrate this, right, in 1800, infant mortality was 1 in 6, right? So if every 6 babies born, one of them would die before their 5th birthday, right? In 2020, it's 1 in 200, right, in the United States. So I'm going to go back to my pen here. It's one of these weird things, right? One of these kind of historical oddities. People will often sort of parrot some version of the following facts that, back in the Middle Ages or, back even in the 19th century, the average life expectancy was something like, between 35 and 45. And that's true. However, what's really important to note is that was largely brought down by a lot of people dying when they were babies, right? If you actually made it to your 5th birthday, your odds of living to 60 or 70 were pretty good. not assured, but pretty decent. It's just that, a lot of people died in those first 5 years of life. And, zero, if you've ever gotten a zero in a class, you know how quickly that drops your average, right? Having a lot of, babies die at zero really lowers the average life expectancy. So that has been the historical norm. And most human beings, until very recently, lived a fast life strategy. Like, get married, have children early, and hope that some of them make it before you yourself perish, probably from some kind of, now preventable disease. Okay, or war or other things. Now, the other one, obviously, you can have fewer children and expect them to grow up slowly. And this is typical when there's less adult and infant mortality, right? So when you're, for us in Canada, I can't remember what the exact life expectancy is. I think it's actually gone down. But I think our life expectancy is somewhere in the 70s, like mid-70s, 74 for men, and 79 for women, somewhere thereabouts. And this is pretty normal for, the developed, industrialized, and wealthy parts of the world, right? People live quite long lives. So, and infant mortality is relatively low. So what you can expect is, in most cases, if you have a small number of children, most of them are going to make it, right? Like it's much more, I don't want to say that it wasn't a tragedy when babies died in the past, but it was much more normal, right? It happened a lot that infants died when they were very little, before their 5th birthday, usually of diseases. Now it's very rare, right? Especially in our societies, it's a huge tragedy when a baby dies. So this is now kind of like, this would be typical for us. So there are, some definite challenges in this kind of system. You tend to see these societies, they're quite advanced, and they're quite resource constrained in some ways, right? So what you see is greater parental investment, right? Education takes longer. When we get to education, we'll talk about how much longer it's taking. Unfortunately, for a lot of you, this is not the terminal stage of your education even, right? A lot of you will go on to do master's degrees because that's becoming more normal as well. Sorry, I shouldn't spill the bad news too early. So there's a big risk of falling behind economically, not as much of a risk of death, but a risk of a sort of like economic lag where you just don't kind of thrive economically. And as these, as it becomes more complex, as these economies become more complex, you need more education to keep up and not fall behind economically, right? So parents have fewer children, in many cases, far fewer children, right? And this is now something, that sociologists and other, I guess not so much psychologists, but sociologists, I think, and political scientists are starting to talk about a lot, where the whole world is entering a sort of fertility crisis where birth rates are so low that we're not replacing ourselves. And this is largely a function of a slow life strategy, right? Because you're putting a ton of resources, right? There's competition for scarce resources, not enough good jobs, not enough, upwardly mobile careers and all of that. And so what parents do is they have fewer children and invest really, really heavily in those children to try to give them whatever leg up they can, right? And you'll see societies like South Korea, where parents, the people who actually choose to have children, which is becoming increasingly rare in South Korea, bless you, investing a ton, right? They're sending their kids to increasingly expensive private tutors, right? Paying to put their kids in expensive private schools and all sorts of programs that'll get them ahead socially, because for the very few good jobs in Korean society. Okay, high prestige jobs in particular. So those are two kinds of life strategies that we typically see, and I think you can already probably intuit that in the period we've talked about, largely we're going to move from where this was the norm, right, the fast life strategy, and today and going forward, I don't see this reversing. Each generation that we're going to talk about moves increasingly into that slow life strategy. Now, what that's going to look like in a lot of cases is, and again, we can see here the kind of echoes of Postman, childhood, and youth, these periods are going to get longer and longer. And adulthood, right, proper adulthood, is going to take longer and longer to reach, right? Which is why, we now have this term in sociology of emerging adulthood, right? Because even from 19 to 29, you're not really a full adult, you're emerging into adulthood, right? Okay, before I jump to the silence, find a question slide. What would I come up with instead of Gen Beta? I don't know, I'm bad at naming things. I mean, I still thank my lucky stars that millennials avoided we were originally tagged as Gen Y, right? Because we were right after Gen X. And I'm glad that somehow we escaped that particular name, because that's really a terrible name. But somehow, from millennials, we went back to Gen Z for some reason. And, Twangy wanted to call them iGen because, you're all on your iPhones all the time. And connected to the internet, which is what the I stands for. I don't know what a better name would be. She suggests the names for Gen Alpha to be the Polars, which I also think is a terrible name. I don't know. It's something cool. Like, I think Gen Z should be the Zoomers. I don't know why. I just like it better. Who comes up with it? It's like this weird social consensus that forms where people start using a term, and if it catches on, you get to be that. And if it doesn't catch on, you're stuck with like Gen Alpha or something bad like that. In what ways do I see AI changing younger generations? Oh, speculation. I really don't know, and I'm really hesitant to make predictions about this, because half of me thinks that AI is a bubble and it's going to kind of collapse and fall in on itself, mostly because it uses way too much power. And we're going to have to build like a nuclear plant every 6 weeks to keep up with me trying to generate memes on ChatGPT. Like the power consumption of it's insane, but I don't really know, right? I think lots of people are already dooming. It's like AI is going to make everyone dumber because you're just going to rely on AI. Potentially, it's going to make a lot of things easier. One of the things it might do, and this is really a terrifying prospect, is a lot of the high status, high paid jobs that people were doing in like the service sector could disappear because AI can do it better. Like, don't become a computer programmer right now. Really bad idea, because coding, AI can do that a lot better than you can, and more consistently. Your grandma took a horse and buggy to school. My grandma too. We had to take her phone away because she would get so worked up over AI information. It's scary how hard it is for them. Oh yes, you had to take your poor grandma's phone away. Grandma, you're cut off. No more Twitter for you. Okay. That's nice. What constitutes many children? Well, that's an interesting question. Okay, so hang on. This one's easier. What constitutes many children? It would depend on the time and place. But certainly, like historically, as long as you didn't die in childbirth, which was also super common, having somewhere between 6 and 15 children wouldn't have been necessarily all that unusual. Right? There's no birth control. It does start to fall. We'll talk about this again when we talk about families. Like, fertility starts to fall, in the 19th century. People do start having fewer children just through, pretty basic birth control techniques. But large families still persist well into the middle part of the 20th century. We're my mom is one of 14. French-Canadian farm family from northern Alberta, right? What are you going to do? So that could be a lot of children. I mean, to be honest, I actually do have a friend, and he and his wife are extremely Catholic. And I say extremely Catholic. I think they, at last count, I haven't seen him in about a year. And every time I see him, there's another child. I assume that at some point they're going to age out, but who knows? They were at 11, which is a lot. And then it's like the last 2 sets were twins. So they're like, well, we sort of went fast through the last 4. I'm like, okay. Interesting. Catholics. Okay. What do I mean? I say this as a Catholic, but I certainly do not have 11 children. What do I mean when I say these slow life strategy people are resource $1 million, right? Those kinds of jobs become harder and harder to get. There's more and more competition. We'll talk about this when we talk about work and education in particular, right? As, it used to be that if you got a bachelor's degree, moving into those jobs, that were really good, right? Careers with pensions and all of that jazz was,
relatively easy. As more and more people get those qualifications, it becomes more and more difficult. And it involves more and more investment in your kids, right? What's that competitive edge they're going to have? Is it, being a concert violinist? Is it having a master's degree or a PhD or what have you, right? So people are putting more and more kind of resources into smaller number of children to try and get them ahead in that economic game, right? I'm going to depress you all horribly in this class. I'm really sorry. You're all doomed. I've already made it, so I'm good. But you're all in. You're like Ralph Wiggum. I'm in danger, right? Was it more beneficial to have lots of kids back then, or were they just freaky? Well, I mean, yes, definitely there's an economic incentive to an extent, right? Before industrialization, certainly, right? More children was more workers on your farm, right? And you didn't have to pay them, you just had to feed them, which was sometimes a problem as well. But, it was more free workers. Well, free. Food was expensive. It was more workers, right? So you could increase your productivity eventually by having more children. I mean, also, they just didn't have birth control at all. And pretty strong, depending on where you were, religious teachings that emphasized high fertility, shall we say. And so people just had a lot of children. And it wasn't that they're freaky, but, the sexual drive is a powerful one. So there you go. Okay, whoops. I'm ahead of myself now. Should I clear that comment? Oh, I'll just flick around back and forth. All right. So our first generation that we're going to talk about here are the silents, right? They're sometimes also referred to as the traditionalists or the lucky generation. Lucky specifically because they didn't have to fight in the war in large part, right? By the time they're kind of, the youngest of them are getting into their military service age, right? The Second World War is largely over, right? So the Second World War ends in 1945. And yeah, you're going to have the kind of people right at the beginning, the 4 starting years of the silent generation who are of military age in that period, and some who sign up when they're like 16 and lie about their age. But largely, this is a generation that didn't fight in the Second World War, right? So but they get this huge benefit because after the Second World War, especially in the United States and Canada, you have a massive and prolonged economic boom, right? So like 1945 to about 1973 is an extended economic boom, right? Things are going gangbusters for almost 3 decades, which, if you're turning 20 in 1945 is really good news for you. Okay, now, these are an oddly overlooked generation, right? Largely because, as Twenge puts it, they're sandwiched between the greatest generation, right? This is the generation that actually went and fought in the Second World War, and the baby boomers, right? Many of whom are the children of the silents. So, sometimes we don't think of them at all. And, as Twenge notes, weirdly, until Joe Biden, I think maybe Donald Trump, can't remember what year Trump was born in. He's like, I want to say he's like 1944, so he's like right at the tail end of this. I'm sure someone will look that up and put it in the comments. But until Joe Biden, the Americans had never had a president who was part of the silent generation, right? It was either greatest generation or baby boomers who had been, is Obama a baby boomer or Gen X? He might be Gen X. Anyway, they'd never had a president that was part of this generation. So weirdly overlooked, and in some ways history has kind of passed them by. So they were part of largely this huge counterculture that happens kind of 1963 to 1970, when most of them are in their 20s, like late 20s and 30s, right? So we often associate, a lot of the things, the hippie movement, women's liberation, civil rights movement with the baby boomers, but actually it was largely driven by the contributions of the silent generation, right? The silents were the ones who in a lot of ways sort of kickstarted it. They were both the intellectual force in a lot of cases behind it, and you can see like famous feminists like Gloria Steinem, was actually silent generation. And lots of the kind of prominent artists, like recording artists and film stars of the period, were also silent generation, right? So Hendrix, 1942, Janis Joplin, 1943. It's towards the end of the silence, and all the members of the Beatles were part of that silent generation. So a lot of the energy, the ideology, and the initial kind of impetus for a lot of the cultural changes that roiled American society from 1963 through 1970 is largely driven by the silence. And this is probably one of the most consequential periods, it's certainly in American history, but maybe in human history altogether. And I might be exaggerating a little bit, but so much of the cultural change that's to come in the West and in American society happens in this period, right? 1968 is especially notable, and that's when people like Foucault, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, become really prominent and really active. Okay, so all of these movements that we tend to think are really important, and we often give to the boomers, right? The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the beginnings of the gay rights movement, which transform, social life from then, and they continue to transform social life today, took root, right? They start in that relatively brief period when the silents were in their 20s and 30s, and they are largely the ones driving the initial phase of it. Okay, so the silence and technology. Oop, where's my... I've lost the ability to... What has happened here? How did I do this? What have I done? There's a hand. Escape. Okay, I don't know what I did. Cool, if I could do that, if I could figure out how to do that again, that'd be super handy. Sometimes I want to zoom in on stuff, and normally I just can't pinch to zoom. It just switches slides. All right, I'm going to work on this. I don't know how I did that. That would be another technological innovation for me. Okay, so, oops, I wanted to change the highlighter. That was the whole point of tapping on the screen initially. Okay, so what is going on technologically for the silence, right? Time to change pen colors. I want to go to green now. Okay, because yellow is ugly. There we go. Green is better. So TV. So certainly there's radio, right? Radio is a big driver, during the Second World War, becomes a really common consumer technology. Through the 40s, it's very, very important. Television, though it's been around since the 1920s as a technology, it hits the mainstream in the 1950s. And part of this is just a lot of the factories that had been building, tanks and planes and putting out rations and military equipment of all kinds. As the war ends, they shift to civilian production. And one of the things they start producing is television, right? And 1952 is sort of generally cited as the year that television really becomes mainstream, and middle-class families start to purchase them in really, really large numbers. So television becomes really important as the silents are young, right? And largely what Twenge suggests is it's important for allowing people to see other perspectives and experiences, right? And there's something about television that's particularly direct, right? It mimics the eye and how you see really carefully, right? So like really clearly, when you look at TV, it's almost like you're looking through someone's eyes, right? And so the silents are going to be a generation that experiences a lot of things almost in the first person. And we'll see this especially, when we get to like Vietnam. Vietnam, we all know kind of the history of the Vietnam War and how controversial it was, but in large part, this is probably driven by television, right? Because there's another war, the Korean War, which happens, and I want to say 1950 to 1953. And while there are certainly problems with the Korean War, it's not nearly as controversial as Vietnam is. But what happens with Vietnam is people start to see a lot of what's going on in Vietnam on television, right? They experience the Vietnam War through their TVs. Okay, so other things that are really notable. Jet and space travel make the world small. And like the beginning of the space age, happens in the lifetime of of the silence, right? By the end of the 1950s, right, we've now got people going into space, right? First with the Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, but Americans followed quickly, and you start to get the expansion of satellites. Satellite communication starts to come in, making the world a much smaller place. But jet travel is no less important because it allows people to travel really quickly to other parts of the globe, right? Much faster than you could in a turboprop airplane. Also, much more comfortable. So jet travel becomes really prominent through the 50s and 60s, allowing people to experience other parts of the world, to travel to Europe, to travel to Asia, and other parts of the globe really, really quickly, which exposes them to many more perspectives. So it shrinks the world, right? And it also allows the world in a lot of ways to come to them, right? Because people use those same technologies to start moving to North America and Europe, bringing their cultures with them, right? Okay. Not that that hadn't been happening before, but it was much slower on boats. So you also get the growth of the service economy. And this is one that we're going to keep coming back to all semester, right? Because I know we're like one point at a time. You've already read all the points, but I'm going to tell you why it's important. We're going to talk about the growth of the service economy all throughout this semester and the differences versus the service economy versus things like manufacturing, agriculture, and resource extraction. But largely, the service economy is really helpful, and it really helps boost that kind of feminist and women's liberation movement because it offers an increasing number of well-paying, skilled jobs that aren't ultimately predicated on physical strength. So prior to this, right, basically most of the good jobs, those that paid really well, were jobs in things like manufacturing, right? And especially a lot of those jobs were really, they're hard jobs, right? Or resource extraction. They're hard jobs that really require a fair bit of physical strength, which men tend to have in greater abundance than women. The service economy, and as it grows, right, and it goes from being something like 20% of the economy to today being over 80% of the economy, really levels the playing field for women in terms of their access to money, right? Good jobs, capital, and all of those things. And this is a huge transformation, and we're still seeing the effects of this today. And we talk about the crisis of men and boys, right? We're going to talk about it again, and we're going to talk about it through the term because we're still feeling the effects of that shift in economics. Okay. And maybe a little bit less tangibly, the mentality for the silence starts to shift, right? And it goes from, a kind of more collectivist idea, one that's much more kind of dominated by duties and rules, to one that is much more focused on individual rights and liberties, right? And we see this shift happening. And again, this, what you might call a rights revolution, is something that's rolling from then till now, right? The kind of language of rights continues to expand and expand and expand, and we're not at the end of the process yet. And yeah, in the 1960s, black and white people were segregated in the US South, and active discrimination against women in the workplace especially was, essentially normal, right? In large part, the expectation was women would work until they got married and then pregnant, and once they got pregnant, right, they would return to the domestic sphere where they would stay at least until their children were in school, but possibly longer. Okay, by the 70s, right, so by kind of the end of the era where the silents are young, all of that had started to change, right, and the world really opens up. And our later born silents, right, so those born kind of towards 1945, were the first to experience more than a third of mothers working while they were school age, right? And again, this is a sort of revolution that happened during their lifetimes. Okay, now that said, I got 10 minutes. I can do this. I can't do this, but I will try. So the silents are kind of weird in some ways too. Actually, do I have questions? Ooh, I have questions. The Vietnam and Cold War. Never forgotten, overlooked. That's kind of what I said. Trump was born in 1946. Okay, so Trump is a boomer, but just barely. Okay. Fun times. Oh, Donald. All right, so the Silents are weird. And the Silents are honestly sort of the weirdest generation that we're going to see in terms of things like fertility. Every other generation, kind of before and after, sort of makes sense. The Silents don't make a lot of sense. Okay, so the Silents are married younger than any other generation born in the 20th century, which includes the two generations before them, right? The Lost Generation and the Greatest Generation. Now, part of this is probably driven by economics, right? They get to grow up and come of age in a booming economic period where certainly, the Lost Generation and then certainly the Greatest Generation were growing up in periods that were far less favorable to early marriage, right? The Greatest Generations, lots of them are becoming adults in the era of the Great Depression, right? Not a great time to get married. But all the generations after also get married later than the Silents did, right? So the age of first marriage for women in the Silents, it declined, and it reached its all-time low in 1956 of an average age of first marriage of 20.1 years old, right? So, like a not unsubstantial number of people in this room, had you been part of this generation, you would already be married, right? I don't know how you feel about that, but that's, sort of what it was. And yeah, nearly half of new brides in the 1950s were teenagers. Now, again, we're generally not talking about like 14-year-olds, right? We're looking generally at people between 17 and 19-year-olds, with a heavy stress like past the age of majority at 18 to 19, but a lot of women got married at 18 and 19, right? So, very, very young by contemporary standards, right? So think about this. Almost every girl in this room, if you were in the Silent Generation, what is it, like half of you would have been married. Because that's the way it was, right? Most of them met their spouses in college or high school and got married right after graduation, right? So if you were kind of middle class and maybe going to college, that's likely where you met. If you were working class, much more likely you met your spouse in high school and got married shortly after graduation. And why did they do that? Well, kind of, and like a lot of human activity, it's because everyone else was doing it, right? It was the social norm. Everyone was getting married young, and that was kind of how you did things. And there was a lot of pressure, on women in particular, but men as well. Like as you're entering your last years of high school, if you're not going to college, or as you're entering the later years of college, to find a husband, right? That you were going to find that person that you were going to marry. There was a lot of social pressure, and it's one of these weird things, right? If like a bunch of your friends start to get married, your odds of getting married go up substantially. If a bunch of your friends start having children, your odds of having a child within 2 years go up substantially. The Silents were conformists, but we're all conformists to some extent, right? Fitting into the group is really important to us, right? And here we see, right? This is our median age at first marriage, right? It's going down, as we kind of move into the middle part of the 20th century for men. For women, it's pretty steady, right? Between 21 and 22, and then it just tanks for the period of the Silents. When the last Silents turned 25, it kind of jumps up again for both men and women. Now, if we follow this along, right, as we move forward, it's going to continue to rise, and now it's nearly 30 for both. Okay. Freaky. I like that word. Okay. Oh, I got 5 minutes. I can't justify ending class 5 minutes early. There's a lot to talk about here, too. So they also have a lot of babies, right? Now, not for nothing, I suppose it's worth mentioning that, the birth control pill isn't approved officially for use as a contraceptive until 1960 in the US and 1968 in Canada, right? So, they're kind of towards the end of this cycle for the silence as well, but it is still a kind of strange cultural phenomenon, one that kind of comes out of the blue and it hasn't been repeated since, and I think is really unlikely to be repeated. So the most common family form the silence had experienced was a two-child family. So most of them grow up in two-child families. And if we look at kind of overall fertility trends, if we go back, to like the beginning part of the 19th century through until basically, 1945, fertility had been slowly declining in Western societies, right? Going from kind of, I think, about a high of like 4.5 children per woman, and kind of gradually dropping. And I think by the time you hit, the Greatest Generation, it's kind of in the low, like 3.1 children per woman, to kind of a little bit over like 2.8, kind of around there, right? And you kind of see it here, right before you get the peak childbearing years for the silence. It's been bouncing around between like 2.3 and like 2.7, 2.8 for the most of the 20th century. And what happens with the silence is it spikes hard, right? So total fertility rate prior to the Great Depression was 2.5 children per woman, and it peaks at 3.8 children per woman around 1958. So right here, right? That is the absolute peak of what's called the baby boom. Now, I do want to stress this because people get this mixed up all the time. The baby boomers, I will tell you this, are not the ones who had the babies. They are the babies, right? This is the baby boom. So when someone tells you that, they talk about boomers, that's the people born in here. But they aren't the ones who had a lot of babies. We'll talk about the boomers. They didn't have that many babies. It's the silence and maybe the tail end of the Greatest Generation that contributed all of these babies, right? So when you talk about the baby boomers on your exams, don't make the mistake of saying the baby boomers had a lot of children. No, kind of like Walter White is the one who knocks. They are the ones who boomed, right? So they were the baby boom, not the ones who had all of the babies. So this is the baby boom, and because you can't have babies when you're still a baby, I'm telling you obvious things now. It's the silence largely that were the parents of the baby boomers, right? So it spikes hard, and it does not return back to that historic or that average just before the start of the Great Depression, right, until 1968. All right, so that is the kind of story. I'll finish this slide, but yeah, those women who had all of these kids were still expected to do the bulk of the domestic tasks with all of those kids, whether they worked full time or not. All right, now I can't justify ending 1 minute early, so let's end there. We'll pick up talking about the silence next time. We're going to keep moving. We're going to roll into the baby boomers. We're going to talk some Gen X on Friday.
Like countered by death rates. So I'm thinking like during World War II and then the Korean and Vietnam War, like the death rate.
So typically, the way that you're describing is you compare like crude birth rate to crude death rate. So like you basically like take total number of births versus total number of deaths.
Like replacement.
Essentially, right? The more common one that people now talk about, and maybe I'll define this next time. It's a good reminder. I spend so much time thinking about this. I don't remember that people don't think like me. They talk about total fertility rate, which is essentially the expected number of children a woman will have in her like fertile years, right? So between usually 15 and 44. And that's a slightly different measure, right? Because it's more like how much, essentially how many children do you expect the average woman to have?